Hi, this is Dr. Hyatt. This is video number 4 for Habit 1, Be Proactive, or Principles of Personal Vision. So Covey talks about something called the social mirror, which says that often our view of ourselves comes from the opinions, perceptions, and paradigms of people around us. It's kind of like going into the fun house at a carnival or amusement park to the hall of mirrors and seeing yourself, and you look distorted. I like the one that shows me taller and more skinny, for example. But that's not a true picture of ourselves, okay? So the problem is that there are usually three sources we look to understand who we are and our perception of ourselves. The first one is called genetic determinism, or your grandparents did it to you. So you are what you are because of your genes. Everybody in your family is bad at math. Everybody in your family can sing good. Everybody in your family has a short temper, whatever it is. And so you do not, or you're not responsible for your own behavior. It's just in your genes, and that's the way it is. The second social mirror he calls psychic determinism, or your parents did it to you. You're the way you are because of the way your parents raised you, the way they treated you when you were young. You may remember the story of the Menendez brothers. Here's a picture of them here. They're in California, who murdered their parents, but their defense was that it was because of the way the parents treated them. They had no choice. Obviously, that's not very accurate either. The third social mirror is called environmental determinism. Your boss or somebody else in your environment did it to you. You'd be happy or good at your job if it weren't for your boss or your roommate or someone else. Now, the problem with all three of these social mirrors is that if we use any one of them, we are escaping responsibility for our own behavior and saying that we really don't have a choice as to who we are. It's determinism. It's determined by either our genes, our psychic determinism, our parents, the way we were raised, or something in our environment. This is all based on what I call the reactive model, which you may have learned about in psychology. So you're faced with a stimulus. For example, a man sees a beautiful woman like Julia Roberts, and he just can't help himself. He has to grab her and kiss her. It's a stimulus followed by response, and therefore he's not responsible. Sometimes men try to use this as an excuse. They say, it's not my fault. I raped the woman. Her skirt was too short. It's a stimulus followed by response. Obviously, that's not a good model, and it's flawed. So what we're trying to do is to not be reactive, but in Habit 1, we're trying to learn to be proactive instead. Okay, so what you're saying is, under Habit 1, is that we should take responsibility for our own behavior. When we're a child, we can say, you are responsible for me. And that's probably true when we're young. But we need to free ourselves from the frustration and anxiety of being a victim, the culture of victimhood. We excuse our behavior by blaming it on others, but we don't need to be victims or captives of how we're treated. You may have remembered when I was telling you in a previous video about a friend of mine who became addicted to gambling and drugs. He took a trip up to Atlantic City, and on the way back he pulled over and tried to go to sleep because he had been drinking, and the police came and said he couldn't park at this convenience market and made him leave. And 5 miles down the road he got arrested for drunk driving. He said, it's not my fault. They made me do it. I'm a victim here. Well, nobody made him drink and drive to begin with, right? He would not take responsibility for his own behavior. So responsibility means we have the ability to choose our response. Responsibility. So I had you do a homework assignment, which was to make a list of your problems and check whether they were directly controllable, indirectly controllable, or not controllable by you. If you put most of them not controllable, you're a very reactive person, saying that you're kind of a victim of circumstances. Indirectly controllable is still leaning that way, but if most of your checks are directly controllable, you're more of a proactive person, and that's what we're trying to get you to do. So let me tell you about this guy named Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl lived in Austria right as World War II broke out. He was a psychologist or psychoanalyst, I guess, and he was also Jewish. And so when the Nazis took over Austria, he was thrown in a concentration camp. And while he was in that camp, they did experiments on him, medical experiments without using anesthesia. But he noticed something. He noticed that while he was in this concentration camp, they were all being treated poorly. But some people were really nice. He called them like angels. They would go around and find somebody that needed to be covered up. They'd cover them up with a blanket or give them their blanket. They would share food with them, protect them from the guards and so forth. But there were other people that were really despicable, according to Frankl, that would steal people's shoes, take away their food, rat on them to the guards. And he said, wait a minute. I've always believed that stimulus equals response, but we're all in this prison having the same stimulus, but we're not responding the same. So his discovery was that between stimulus and response, we have the freedom to choose our response. We can be like the angels or we can be like the despicable persons. And so we can make our choices into how we respond. So let's listen to Viktor Frankl speak for a few minutes. I know he has a deep German accent, but try hard to listen to him, and he'll talk about this.
To get back to suffering and despair, sometimes it seems that some people seem to have a much heavier load than others. Do these people not feel after a while, can I still continue to take meaning?
You wouldn't believe it. It comes to mind that there is a specific statistical, strictly empirical study that was published a couple of years ago by two famous psychologists. And it turned out, by way of not only of statistics, but by test batteries, that people prone to death, who knew that they were dying soon, had a higher sense of meaning than normal populations. And if I tell you the story that the dean of the School of Nursing at the University of Texas, in the Texas Medical Center in Houston, a famous center, she wrote me of a case of a young girl, very young girl, about 17 years of age or so, who was paralyzed totally, also up to her neck, and could only, by use of a mouth stick, type letters. And Dean Stark, that nurse, told me within 3 lines, I remember this letter, she told me that that girl is reading newspapers day by day, watching television, and as soon as she comes across an individual in a tragic life situation, she types with a mouth stick on the typewriter letters offering them consolation and comfort. And she has some credibility, believe me. And she, the dean, Stark, says she's full of confidence. She has a strong sense of abundant meaning in her life, while others who cannot see meaning under the best conceivable of conditions take their lives because they are frustrated. They are caught in an existential vacuum, in a sense of meaninglessness and emptiness. I have described it in a book of mine as soon as in 55. Since that time, it has ever more been increasing worldwide. You find you are facing it not only in Western countries, you are facing it in the so-called third world, you are facing it in communist states, and communist psychiatrists also describe it in their literature. What Frankl tells us about this existential frustration is also observable in the communist countries.
So are you saying that in order to find meaning, it is necessary to experience suffering?
I wouldn't say it is necessary to experience suffering. What I say is just that meaning can be found under each and every condition in life, even under the worst conceivable conditions, provided that it is a situation you cannot change. Remember, I said this explicitly. That means, provided that the cause of your suffering cannot be removed. If you can remove the cause of the suffering, say in case of a cancer, by surgery, you have to undergo surgery. If you are suffering from a severe compulsive obsessive neurosis, you have to seek psychotherapeutic help. There are, within the realm of logotherapy, for instance, certain techniques that can be applied with much success, as has been evidenced not by logotherapists but by behaviorists. And finally, if you are confronted with sociological conditions that have caused your suffering, then you are called upon to change the situation, to remove the cause of your suffering by political action, for instance. But in this respect, I would like to make another additional statement by telling you something that I, a couple of weeks ago, have told my professors and students forming my audience at the Karl Marx University in Moscow. I was invited by the prorector to stay there for a month and to lecture there on my teachings, but I had only time for 2 days. And I told them, don't think that I came to you from the West in order to sell you any political opinions. No, I don't come as a politician, but I speak to you on a meta-political level. This means that I recognize only, on a worldwide scale, only 2 styles of politics, or 2 types of politicians. The one is he, the politician, who thinks that the end justifies the means, any means. While the second type remains fully aware that there are means that would desecrate even the most noble end. And they were applauding, they had an understanding. And so I don't come into any country with a preconceived political conviction. I'm not entitled to judge it, but I have the responsibility to accept any call wherever in the world to deliver a message, if any should be present, and to act as an MD, as a doctor of medicine, and as such I had to take the Hippocratic oath that compels me to try to offer a cure to each and every individual or also population, if they invite me to do so.
Dr. Frankl, I'm going to ask you now, as you know, this country is going through a very difficult time. We have an economic recession. To get back to...
Okay, that's enough of that. So what he was saying is that freedom comes from the use of, and he found this out when he was on the operating table without anesthesia and they were doing medical experiments on him, self-awareness, realizing who we are. So the Nazis said that he wasn't even human, but he realized he was a human of worth. By use of imagination, the ability to create in our minds beyond our present reality. So he would imagine himself being somewhere else. By the use of conscience, a deep inner awareness of right and wrong. He knew it was right to help his fellow prisoners and wrong not to. and by independent will, the ability to act free of outside influences. We can decide how we want to behave. Now, in this other talk that you just heard him give, he said that despair comes from suffering without meaning. But when we have meaning in our lives, then we don't necessarily feel despair. The girl who wrote notes with a pencil or whatever, a stick in her mouth, found meaning in her life, and therefore she did not suffer despair. Covey also talks about something which I call circles. He said that there are circles of concern, things that we're concerned about, and there are things that we're not concerned about. So you may be concerned about the homeless situation, the opioid crisis. Maybe you're not concerned about the outcome of the soccer match between Frankfurt and Wiesbaden in Germany. So there's some things you're concerned about and some that you're not concerned about. Now, within that circle of concern, there are things that you can influence, that you can do something about. And Covey says that being proactive enlarges our circle of influence. Let's listen to him talk about that.
You can usually tell a person's proactive or reactive nature by listening to their language. It's kind of the fingerprint of where the locus of control is, whether it's inside or outside. Really. I can't do this. Have to do this. I had a student one time. Would you excuse me from class? I have to go on a tennis trip. I said, what? We just finished talking about how the language of the proactive person is, I choose to, I prefer to, yes, no, I will. The language of the reactive person, I have to, I must, if only, I can't, I haven't time, I'm low man on the totem pole, look what's above me. The people who need this aren't here, or if they are here, they're not getting it. I was going through all of that. He said, "Would you excuse me from class? Next week I have to go on the tennis trip." He said, "What? I have to go on the tennis trip." You what? I have to go. You have to go? You have to go? Oh yeah. What'll happen if you don't go? They'll kick me off the team. Seems like a natural consequence to me. If you don't go on the trips, you can't be on the team. What'll happen if you don't come to my class? I don't know. What's the natural consequence of not coming to class? I don't know. I mean, think. What naturally will happen if you don't come to class? Well, I mean, you wouldn't kick me out, would you? Well, that would be a social consequence. That's artificial. It's not natural. If you won't participate, you shouldn't be on the team. On a tennis team, that would be natural. What will naturally happen if you don't come to class? I guess I missed the learning. That's right. I know if it were me, I'd choose to go on the tennis trip. But never say you have to do anything. You have the power to choose. He meekly said, I choose to go on the tennis trip and miss my class. You're always working with an analysis of alternative consequences, and then you're making a choice about the actions. Remember, you can choose your actions, but you cannot choose the consequences. They're governed by natural laws or principles. You may be in some environments where they're governed by social values, social rules. Then you may have to make some tough decisions, either to become a change catalyst in some way or to seek elsewhere, particularly if you've done a lot of sharpening the saw professionally, personally, and have all kinds of options because you are not economically dependent. You're economically independent. That doesn't mean wealthy. That means you have the power to produce sufficient wealth for your needs and the needs of your family. Why? Because your skills are not obsolete. Think on it this way. Two circles. the larger outer circle you call the circle of concern. Things you're concerned about, things you're worried about. But then there is an inner circle that's very small that are concerns you have influence over. Where do proactive people focus their energies? Which circle? The inner circle. Where do reactive people focus their energies? The outer circle. Why? Because they're victimized. Look at this person I have to live with. Look at how my boss has dead-ended my career. She says she has an open mind, but she has a closed mind. Look at these kids. They're driving me crazy. Why do you choose to go crazy? Well, I mean, what else could you do? What else could you do? Well, I don't know. Think. I don't know. Think. What other alternatives do you have other than going crazy? I don't know. Think hard. I guess I could maybe try to rebuild a relationship to a point that we could come up with some discipline agreements. What's your choice? You have the power. Always treat people as if they're proactive. The more irresponsible they are, the more you teach them about their responsibility. Always work on the inner circle. It is a marvelous thing. It is inevitable. Inevitable. If you work on the inner circle, it'll get larger. Always. Why? The energy there is positive. You're doing something at the outside edge of that inner circle that wins more confidence with other people. The way you treat them, the way you make and keep promises, the way you apologize when you make mistakes, the way you gather feedback, the way you give feedback, the way you're trying to play God in someone's life, the way you seek to understand what's important to the other so that your presentations are made in terms of their frame of reference, their language, their value system. You're constantly making deposits into the emotional bank account. But if you focus on the outer circle, you're taking withdrawals. You're judging. You're criticizing. You don't seek to understand. You're not consistent. All in the name of their inconsistency. You overreact in the name of their overreaction. You badmouth them behind their back, unaware that the people you're talking to as you do the badmouthing know you're going to do the same thing about them when there's a strain on that relationship. If you want to retain those who are present, my friends, always be loyal to those who are absent. They know you're principle-centered. They know you're just not sucking up to the social value system. That you're a person of integrity, that have standards. You will not participate in negative energy exchanges or do anything that in any way would create a feeling of disrespect toward another person, because they know that would attach to them sometime under another situation. That's why you would never confide with one child about another, or make comparisons or quick quips and judgments and labels, because you create a culture that they know you're doing the same thing about them when the situation changes. No, there's a steadiness about you that is based on principles that never change, not based upon moods that are volatile and mercurial, that are always going up and down. So by working on the inner circle, it gets larger and larger and larger. And eventually you begin to deal with some of those concerns that you have that today you couldn't even begin to touch. I could take you to not tens, but to hundreds, perhaps even thousands by now, of organizations that are going through a profound transformation, and it started with a person at the bottom who worked on the circle of influence, who took responsibility, who was patient, lived the law of the harvest, whose circle of influence gradually got larger and larger. In most cases, they came in contact with someone that had a huge circle of influence. Then leverage, multiplication took place. Exponential leverage that started to influence entire divisions, entire companies, multi-billion multinationals. Let me share with you one of the most powerful, instructive, illuminating experiences along this line of habit one, to be proactive, that I've ever had. I worked with an organization for 4 years and was the assistant to the president. He was a very dynamic, visionary person. So talented, so intelligent, so visionary, that it could just about compensate for a multitude of sins as far as the outside world was concerned. But his style was very controlling and dictatorial. Consequently, all the people around felt that they were treated like gophers, as if they had no judgment of their own. Go for this, do this, gopher, 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 see. And they would sit around, basically, in the executive corridors, confessing the president's sins. Swapping war stories. Let me tell you the latest. I had things going. He came into my department, gave a different signal, and totally disrupted the whole plan. You think that's... Wait till you hear this one. Hey, why don't we get together at lunch? We can go further into it. It's fun. It's fun because it becomes a kind of common cement that unites you. Construction people have the expression bad mud, meaning if the basic content of the brick is flawed, you stress the brick, it'll break. It's the same thing happens every time you badmouth. It's bad mud. At the time, it unites you, but you take a stress on that relationship, it'll break it, because they know you're doing the same thing. The inner circle withers. One man, name was Ben. He was proactive. His life was not a function of the president's weaknesses. He was aware of them. They were in a circle of concern, but not a circle of influence. Therefore, he smiled a lot. He didn't disempower himself. He used his strengths to compensate for the president's weaknesses in his own small circle of influence, with his own people. Very strong, considerate, courageous, buffer. He ran with the president's strengths, which were prodigious, enormous. So in his area, the president's strengths and his strengths compensated for the president's weaknesses. Started to cause his circle to get larger in his own area. He also exercised so much more initiative. He was treated like a gopher, go for this, but he was the best gopher around. He not only went for the data, he tried to anticipate the need. I think the president wants that for a board meeting. I'm going to give him the data, the analysis of the data, and the recommendations based on that analysis. And I'm going to put it in the presentation form. The president would say to me, I can't believe, Ben. It's just amazing, really. Look what he's done. I asked him to get this. He anticipated my need. He's analyzed it. He developed alternative recommendations. He came up with one, and it's in the form that I can make to the board. I think I'll have him make it. Circle of influence. Next meetings. Go for this. Go for this. Go for this. Go for this. Ben, what's your opinion? What do you think the reactive minds did in the executive corridors that day? See, reactive people are always looking for evidence. I'll bet there's some kind of favoritism going on here. The problem is, Ben dealt with them in the same way he dealt with the president. Over a 4-year period, I saw Ben become the number 2 person in the organization. His circle of influence got so large. Even the president would not make any significant moves without Ben's blessing. And Ben read the culture, understood the culture. So the president's weakness in style was being compensated for by Ben's strength with cultural awareness, so that the president's judgments about how to implement this vision, actualize the vision, was strengthened. Amazing thing.